Alfred the Great, common law, please welcome Albert Burgess.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Right. I come with a health warning because everybody that I've ever met in my life called Albert has been stark raving mad, and I will illustrate that by a little story. I was on duty on foot patrol one evening in the Pentonville Road with my friend Tony. Now Tony is a born traffic policeman, which means he's had the lobotomy really. And we were walking up the road and minding our own business, and we saw these two carloads of Asian gentlemen leapfrogging one another up the road. So we stopped them on principle, and all I could get out of people in my car was no English, only Hindi, no English, only Hindi. And as they weren't actually breaking any laws, and I actually quite badly wanted a cup of tea, I thought I'd give Tony a heavy hint, because being a traffic policeman, he was going to summon somebody for something, no matter how long it took, and not how unreasonable. So I walked across the road to the other side of Pentonville Road, thinking that would give him a heavy hint that I'm going back for my cup of tea, and he should follow, but he didn't. But what I saw was walking towards me down the road was this gentleman. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and he's walking down the road with a cigarette packet on a wallet like this. And I said to him, "Good morning, sir." And he said to me, "Good morning, officer." And I said, "Are you all right, old son?" And he said to me, "Well, I don't mind telling you I'm not." And I said, "What's the problem?" He said, "I haven't had any sleep for 3 days." And I said, "Why is that?" Because being a policeman, you ask stupid questions all the time. And he said, "It's the entity." I said, "What entity?" He said, "The entity that's trying to kill me, but I've managed to trap it in the cigarette packet." "But I can't go to sleep, because if it gets out when I go to sleep and let go of the packet, it will kill me." So I thought to myself, this is a definite place of safety arrest. But I didn't want to upset the man by telling him I was going to arrest him. So I said to him, "Well, I'll tell you what, old son, why don't you come for a nice ride in a police car with me, and we'll go down the police station and we'll throw the cigarette packet in one of our cells." And he said, "Will that be okay?" And I said, "Yeah, all our cells are entity-proof, believe me." So we whistled up the van, and the sergeant said, "What have you got, Albert?" So I told him. So we put the bloke in the back of the van, we drove down the police station, we got out. When I walked into the custody suite with the man still holding the cigarette packet and the wallet, and he said to me, the custody sergeant said, "What have you got, Albert?" And the other sergeant said, "You don't want to know, I'll sort this one out." And we did. And he walked over to a bin, one of these flip-top pedal bins, and he flipped it up, and he reached in, and he pulled out a green first aid box that was empty. And he said to the man, he said, "Right," he said, "what I want you to do, so I want you to put your hand in the box, because this is an entity-proof box. When I say now, let go of the cigarette packet, get your hand out quickly." He did that. I was standing by the bin. The sergeant said, "Now." He pulls his hand out. Sergeant slams the lid shut, throws the box across the room to me. I've caught it, threw it in the bin, slammed the lid down, and the sergeant and I looked at one another and we went, "Oh, that was close." And now I've got to put pen to paper. So I said to the man, "What's your name?" And he said, "Albert." so from there on in, I was entity Albert for months at a time. So basically, I come with a health warning because everybody called Albert is stark raving mad, as far as I know. Yeah. Anyway, down to tonight. There are a number of things going on in the country which we obviously don't like, because that's why you're here. And being a policeman, I don't like them, because they say once a copper, always a copper. And being a policeman, I don't like them much either. And I look at it and I think to myself, is there a law against it? And I look at the laws and I say, yes, there are several. Have those laws been broken? Not bloody much they haven't. Who broke them? That lot over there. Whose job is it to fix it? Well, it's the job of a little man with a blue pointed hat on his head. And that's where I started on December 2006. I was given some information which I read. I was told it was of historical interest, and halfway through reading it, I was thinking, my God, this is sedition. Now, that set me on a learning curve. And so I set out to decide will somebody please kick me when I do that? I set out on a learning curve to find out exactly what our law is and how it developed. And the story that I'm going to start off by telling you is that. How our law developed, why it developed, and then the crimes committed against it. And we're going to finish up with what I would like you to do by taking ownership of a tiny bit of the fight back yourselves. Now, I have written this book, A Layman's Guide to the English Constitution. And we have to start somewhere. I could start by saying that we are in fact the survivors of the lost tribes of Israel, but I won't go back that far. We're going to start with Alfred the Great. Alfred the Great was called Alfred the Great many hundreds of years after he'd actually died because of the achievements that he made in his life. And they are achievements which in fact influence the way we do things in this country even today. Which is why I say England is still ruled by Alfred the Great through the laws he gave us. And that in fact applies as much today as it did in Alfred's day. And what Alfred did, having gone to war and sorted out the Danes and having developed a navy which was bigger, with bigger, better ships than the Danes so we could beat them at sea before they landed, having instigated a form of national service where half the people in a fortified village or town would be doing their normal daily job, which was probably, if you were in the rural area, tending the farm and the crops and the animals, and the other half were fully booted and spurred in full battle gear in case they were invaded, and they would keep up the fight until the people could come back from the fields and help them, and they would fight then in a fortified village until a much larger army could be assembled to come and help them. And this was the first ever national service, really, and they would take it in turns. So this month you're all fully booted and spurred as a soldier, next month you're out pushing a plough, and somebody else who's pushing the plough today is fully booted and spurred as a soldier the following month. He did that, but he also decided that the answer, the actual thing which was most important, was education. Tony Blair said that, didn't he? Education, education, education. Probably the only time in his life Tony Blair didn't tell a lie. Now, Alfred decided he was going to have education, so he went actually to the foreign monasteries, because that's where all the education was in mainland Europe, and he got people sent over here to teach in our abbeys and our monasteries, and in fact they started sort of universities. And if you were an alderman, then, and you were old and you said, well, I don't want to learn all this newfangled rubbish like how to read and how to write, then Alfred the Great took away the fact that you were an alderman. He sacked you as an alderman, and he appointed somebody younger who was prepared to learn, because he wanted the people in authority in England to be able to read and write and understand what was going on, and then work out logically what the answers to it were. So that was what Alfred the Great did. But he did more than that, because having sorted out the Danes in around about 886, nobody knows for exactly when it was, but it was in that sort of period, Alfred went round all of the old kingdoms and he gathered up all of the best laws and customs from those kingdoms, and he wrote them down in a book he called the Dun, which he showed to the Witan, and he said, is this good law? And the Witan looked at the book and they discussed it, and they came back and they said, yes, it's good law. And Alfred, in fact, then published that and distributed it across the whole of Alfred's kingdom, which was everything south of Watling Street, as the King's Law. And it was the first ever book of constitutional law for the English. The very first ever book. And it was very enlightened, because up until that day, because the Anglo-Saxons had slaves and things, and your wives really weren't a lot better. But Alfred the Great decided that he would make a few changes there. And one of the changes that he made was that if you were a widow, because your husband had just died, and you were young and nubile and sexy, and somebody wanted you to be their wife, and the king of the time wanted that person to do them a favour, then he would marry this 23-year-old off to some 67-year-old like me, and say, well, there you are, here's your wife, here's all the estates that go with her, now do the favour for me. Alfred said, no widow should be forced to marry against her will. That was very enlightened for those days. And so we then get this law book. Now, for those of you who don't know, you all know what a law is, don't you? But do you know what a custom is? A custom is a law that has been in use for so long, in fact they say from times of greatest antiquity, with the approval of the people who use the law. And it becomes the custom and practice of England, and Parliament have no say over it. They cannot repeal it, because it is the custom and practice of England. So when you actually go out and you say something that you genuinely believe, if that upsets somebody, tough. That is the custom and practice of England, that you have a right of free speech. Now if you're in Scotland, you don't have that right to the same extent, because in England, a breach of the peace requires an immediate apprehension that there will be a breach of the peace, which is actually a physical act of violence. In Scotland, a breach of the peace is you annoy somebody. So we've all seen, haven't we, Robert Greene got arrested up in Scotland for a breach of the peace, and everybody down here was saying, oh, this is disgraceful, they've arrested Robert Greene for a breach of the peace, and that's not right. Well, of course, if he'd been in England, it wouldn't have been right. But when Robert Greene is going up into Scotland, and he's saying to somebody, well, I think the Procurator Fiscal is actually covering up for paedophiles, you can understand the Procurator Fiscal might just get a little bit upset about that, and that is all it takes in Scotland to be arrested for breach of the peace, somebody to be upset about what you are doing. No immediate apprehension of violence, no actual violence, merely the fact that you've upset somebody. So there are differences in the laws. Now, I shall talk about the English Constitution because we have an English Constitution. The Scots have their own constitution, which in fact is older than the English Constitution because the Romans never invaded Scotland successfully. Who would want to? Now,
I would. I like Scotland.
The door is that way. Keep going north. Anyway, so they have their own constitution, we have ours. So I'm not dealing with the Scottish Constitution because frankly I haven't bothered to study it because I live in England and it's the English Constitution which interests me. Now, when Alfred's grandson Athelstan came to the throne, Athelstan in fact then managed to capture the whole of England one way or another, so he then became the king of the entire country of England. And Alfred's law was then promulgated throughout the whole of England as the King's Law. And that was the case when Edward the Confessor died and Harold came to the throne. Now, Duke William of Normandy said that Edward the Confessor had promised him the throne. He'd said, I am going to leave the throne of England to you when I die, so you will be the next King of England. But in point of fact, that has to be complete and utter nonsense. because it is not within the gift of our kings to decide who should inherit the throne when they die. Our kings are elected, and if you don't believe that, they are elected by virtue of the fact that the people of England have a right to reject them. And so when Prince Charles goes into Westminster Abbey to get crowned, as I'm sure he will one day, a knight in full armour rides into Westminster Abbey and he throws a gauntlet onto the floor and he says, "Is there any foul and base traitors here who say that King Charles should not be the king, Prince Charles should not be the king? If there are, step outside and we'll sort it out."
Bring it on, bring it on.
I have a friend of mine who's an ex-Territorial Army parachutist who says he's going to do his level best to get into Westminster Abbey to pick up the gauntlet. Because it should be a good fight, shouldn't it? You've got some 90-year-old duke on horseback and a young parachutist having a fight. So, but basically, we elect our kings. We cannot, the king that's dying cannot hand it over. So, Duke William's claim to the English throne is based on no more than the hot air that was coming out of his mouth at the time, because it simply is not allowed to happen under English law. Now, but he came anyway, and we all know that King Harold, being an Anglo-Saxon, was a bit hot-blooded, and he'd been up north and he'd trashed a load of Danes up north. He caught them at night with their, all their armour off and everything else, and his troops slaughtered the Danes. And he was then told that William had landed in the south. So instead of waiting for his army to rest overnight and then coming down slowly with his complete and full army, which he had with him, he actually took those that were mounted on horseback and he rushed down south as fast as he could and gathered up what he could when he got there, and they went into action. Now, even so, with a makeshift army, even so, they were winning. The Normans kept breaking on the Anglo-Saxon shield wall, and they were getting nowhere. So William decided they would try a little feint. They attacked the wall, and then they turned and ran. And the Anglo-Saxons, being hot-blooded and not listening to anybody, thought the enemy were running away. So they all let off down the hill after them, uttering bloodthirsty calls, blood-thirsty shouts, and actually waving their battle axes and swords in the air. At which point, another lot of cavalry came and trampled them all to pieces. The net result was King Harold was killed, we're told by an arrow through the eye, and William became William I of England. Now, the first thing that William did, and this made absolute sound common sense, because William was a Frenchman, or Norman French, which in fact is not really French at all, they are Norsemen from the north. And basically, he did something which was eminently sensible. He said, "I will keep the laws of Edward the Confessor," which was Alfred's law. Because it made no sense, having captured the country, to try and impose a complete lot of Norman French laws on the population, which none of them would understand. So he kept Edward the Confessor's laws, which was actually Alfred's law, because Edward the Confessor might have been very religious, but he didn't do much in the way of making law. So basically, we still kept that law. Now, William's son, William Rufus, decided that he, in fact, being the King of England, could rule by divine right. It's some continental idea that they have, that they rule by divine right. And he's doing all sorts of things that he shouldn't be doing, including having his favourites given the best jobs and, generally looking the other way when they committed crimes and all sorts of things like that. And William Rufus was out hunting one day when he was shot through the heart with an arrow, entirely, we are told, by accident, because the arrow was aimed at an animal and it actually glanced off a tree and went straight into his heart. This is in the days when bowmen in England could take the eye out of a pigeon at 100 yards in flight. But it was written down as an accident, that way they didn't have to kill anybody for killing the king. Anyway,